Fog lay over the Gulf of Salerno, pinning the horizon to the water and stripping the shoreline of depth. The American gun pit sat behind a low berm of sandbags and broken stone near the beachhead, its planks slick with salt and its radios humming on a generator that misfired every few minutes. Men wiped lenses and metal in a steady rhythm that never won against the moisture because the air carried spray even when the surf itself could not be seen. A forward call came in with urgency. A dark shape had been spotted near the surf line inside the sector that covered the next advance inland. The report carried a bearing and an estimated distance, followed by the warning that friendly elements worked close to the same strip of sand. The request that followed was simple and absolute: immediate suppression. First Lieutenant Andrew Hayes kept his pencil moving. He wrote the time, the call sign, and the exact wording of the request. He added the condition that governed every number that morning: visibility constrained by heavy coastal fog, reference points degraded by tide and spray, friendly proximity confirmed but shifting. Only then did he order action, and even that action had gates. He directed the gun crews to set a preliminary azimuth only, the most conservative line that could cover the reported sector without crossing the mapped friendly corridor. He ordered elevation locked at 0 and required each crew chief to repeat the setting back before the breech blocks were closed. On the berm, an observer raised binoculars and lowered them, unable to hold a stable image. Fog beads formed on glass faster than a sleeve could clear them. The surf threw white flashes that imitated movement, and the tide erased shallow markers that had existed an hour earlier. Hayes required a fixed reference point, something above the wash with a shape that did not change. The observer searched and reported what he could defend: a rock outcrop and a ruined wall line farther inland. Hayes marked both on the map cover and wrote their bearings in the log, not as targets but as anchors for cross-checking any report. A plotting assistant opened the field manual to the page for limited visibility. Hayes had him read the constraints aloud, not for ceremony but to synchronize the pit. Under fog, the sequence tightened: confirm the friendly line by time, require at least 2 independent observations on a fixed reference, and treat uncertain identification as a stop condition. Hayes assigned tasks to make those constraints real. Communications pulled fresh friendly positions and demanded a time of last movement. The observer team split to find a second fixed feature, and the plotting assistant prepared a second sheet for cross entries that could not be smudged into convenience. The waiting aggravated the men who felt the beachhead exposed. One crew chief leaned in, insisting that a short burst would at least break up whatever sat near the surf. Hayes did not debate intent. He pointed to the danger sector he had drawn around the friendly corridor and required the crew chief to initial it. The initial turned instinct into accountability. The chief stepped back, jaw tight, and returned to his post. Hayes wrote the exchange as a procedural note: request for immediate suppression received, firing restricted pending confirmation of friendly positions and target identification. A runner arrived from the rear with a guard detail. Between 2 soldiers walked an enemy observer, boots heavy with wet sand, hands bound in front. A battered leather case hung from a strap over his shoulder and knocked against his ribs with each step. Men in the pit turned toward him with the hard attention reserved for a captured foe brought close to the guns, because proximity invited fantasies of fast answers and faster vengeance. Hayes cut that attention into procedure. He directed the guards to place the prisoner on a bare patch of sand well away from the plotting board, close enough to be questioned, far enough to keep him outside the chain that controlled the guns. The sergeant removed the leather case and stepped back. The prisoner's shoulders tightened as the strap left him, and his eyes followed the case as if it anchored his breath. The guards kept him facing the pit, not as a courtesy, but so every movement could be observed and recorded. Hayes made the transfer official: time, location, custodian, description. The sergeant dictated what he could see and smell: worn seams, salt-staining mildew odor, brass buckles dulled by exposure. Hayes required the capturing guard to add his name and the time of capture. Names and times mattered because they fixed responsibility. Without them, a decision became an accident, and accidents became crimes. When a shell fell where it should not, the case received a tag number. The prisoner received a separate entry with his name, the guard detail, and the restriction that he would not approach the plotting board. The corporal assigned to questioning approached with a notebook. Hayes defined the scope before the first question. The prisoner would not be brought into the pit. He would not see firing tables or plotted grids. No request would be made for precise coordinates. Anything the prisoner offered would be treated as a risk variable, never as a direct trigger for firing. The corporal started with identity and role. The prisoner gave an Italian-sounding name and a coastal artillery observation function. His answers came clipped and controlled, and when pressed toward bearings, he shifted to describing fog effects and tide markers instead of numbers that could be fired. Radio traffic continued to press. The forward edge asked again for suppression, and the voice carried a sharper edge now that minutes had passed. A higher headquarters voice came on another channel and demanded speed. Hayes answered with structure, not heat. Target unconfirmed under visibility constraints. Friendlies inside the hazard arc. Verification measures in progress with times logged, updated, friendly line positions requested and pending. He wrote the call sign into the log and underlined the time, making the pressure part of the record rather than a private burden that could be claimed away later. The captured case went to the side table reserved for equipment checks. Hayes did not open it himself. He ordered the optics technician to inspect it under custody rules. The technician arrived with a cloth and a small tool kit, copied the tag number, recorded the time he took custody, and opened the case under the awning. Inside lay a metal and glass rangefinder built for shoreline geometry. The padding was stained where it had rested for years. The technician noted moisture on the lens caps, a film on the eyepiece, and grit in the focus wheel, and he recorded all three before he cleaned anything. From his patch of sand, the prisoner watched the instrument handled like evidence. His bound wrists flexed once, then stilled when the guard shifted. He spoke to the corporal in tight, technical language, insisting that fog and spray expanded error, that wet glass bent certainty into confidence games, that tide lines moved landmarks. Hayes treated the insistence as a constraint, not a plea. He ordered a second observer to confirm the rock outcrop, entered both bearings with both names, and directed the crews to maintain their conservative lay. Smoke rounds stayed staged as a contingency, and communications kept pulling fresh, friendly positions with times of last movement so that any future order would sit on a traceable foundation. The fog shifted with the tide, thickening along the waterline and thinning in streaks that offered no clean view. The dark shape remained in the sector, still unconfirmed, still demanding an irreversible choice. Inside the gun pit, the gun stayed silent, held not by hesitation, but by a chain of names, times, and limits that kept the muzzle from outrunning the facts. Fog did not lift so much as rearrange itself. It loosened into narrow seams that hinted at open water and then poured back into the gaps, turning the horizon into a moving boundary. Each shift invited someone to treat the next darker patch as a target. Hayes made that temptation visible in ink. He added a standing constraint to the log. Any object inside the hazard arc remained non-engageable until two independent observations tied it to fixed references within the same 5-minute window, with the observers' names and times written beside the bearings. The forward radio net pressed again. Infantry patrols had begun probing past the first dunes, and the request for suppression returned with a deadline tied to the next movement cycle. The report claimed friendly elements would not be in the immediate surf zone, but it also admitted the line was fluid and that guides were navigating by sound and touch as much as sight. Hayes demanded the patrol limit in grid form required the time of last verified position and ordered the radio operator to read that time back before he would copy it into the book. The extra seconds felt like delay to the men with hands on steel, but they turned a frantic request into an entry that could be defended. He drove the pit toward readiness without breaking the chain that governed the guns. The plotting assistant laid out two options on separate sheets so no one would be forced to improvise under pressure. One option assumed a conservative pattern short of the friendly corridor, even if range drifted, with deflection and elevation bounded by hard stops and a strict limit on rounds. The second option assumed smoke rather than high explosive, designed to obscure the suspected sector and reduce the chance that a misidentified shape would cause an irreversible mistake. Hayes signed both sheets to show ownership of the limits, and he kept them on the board where any crew chief could see what was permitted and what was not. Observers went back to work under constraints that the fog made punishing. One man crawled up the berm with a compass and a waterproof card, tasked with bearings to the rock outcrop and the ruined wall line inland. Another moved lower, close enough to smell the surf, tasked with watching for motion that cut against the tide rather than flickering with it. A third stayed near the pit with binoculars trained on the same anchors, so his field of view matched the map on Hayes's board. Hayes required each report to include the time observed and how long the feature stayed visible, because a 2-second glimpse was not a foundation for shells. The prisoner remained on the sand patch under guard, bound and damp through his uniform. The corporal continued questioning under Hayes's restrictions, keeping the captive away from the plotting board and any firing tables. The captive described fog effects in the language of optics and shoreline geometry, emphasizing spray on glass, shifting tide lines, and the way a wet lens could move a reading without the user noticing. He framed distance as a band of error rather than a point. Hayes accepted the caution as plausible, but he also heard what it did to the pit. It sounded like evasion to men who wanted a number. Hayes cut that drift back into rules before resentment became action. He ordered the corporal to shift from open prompts to discrete checks that could be logged and later verified. Whether the suspected sector contained known obstacles, whether posts or painted markers existed on that stretch of beach, whether the rock outcrop aligned with a man-made landmark the captive recognized from his observation work. Each answer would be written with a time and the corporal's name. Anything that could not be answered in that format would not enter the fire control chain. The immediate effect was clarity of procedure, and the cost was loss of nuance. The captive resisted the narrowing without overt defiance. He hesitated, then tried to add qualifiers again, still wrapped in generalities about what fog did to sight. Impatience rose at the edge of the pit. The guard sergeant stepped forward, and a gun crewman shifted his weight as if ready to join him. Hayes intervened by enforcing separation rather than debating motives. He ordered the captive move back 2 paces, required the guards to keep him oriented away from the gun line whenever a fire sheet was being handled, and limited questioning to yes or no prompts that could be tied to map features already in the log. Hayes recorded the first setback in unadorned terms. Enemy observer interviewed under restrictions, responses assessed as non-actionable within fire control, Access further constrained to prevent contamination of firing data. The entry protected legitimacy by showing the captive had not been used to generate firing coordinates, and it told the pit that the prisoner would not provide the clean answer men wanted. Pressure shifted back onto American sources. Hayes responded by widening the internal verification net, not loosening standards. He set communications observers and the plotting board into a tighter loop where every input carried a name and a time. Communications was ordered to obtain a third confirmation of friendly positions from a different relay, not because Hayes distrusted the first two, but because independent sources could expose drift. He required the forward net to state the time of last verified position in every transmission and refused to accept a location without it. At the same time, he ordered observer reports on a schedule, 1 per minute, so he could compare bearing changes against the tide's rhythm. The pit became a machine for timestamps, cross entries, and repeat backs, and the radio room grew hotter with each forced repetition. The third friendly report arrived with a patrol limit that did not match the second, and its timestamp aligned with neither. Hayes forced reconciliation by requesting the movement plan that explained the discrepancy and the time that plan had last been confirmed. While communications chased that answer, the observer bearings diverged. The berm observer reported the ruined wall line shifting relative to the rock outcrop by a small but persistent amount. The pit observer reported the rock outcrop constant and blamed the wall line's outline for breaking in the mist. The surf observer reported the water line creeping up, changing the apparent base of the dark shape and making it seem larger than it had been. Hayes refused to average contradictions into a false certainty and ordered the gun crews to hold. That halt became the second setback. The measures designed to defend a decision had produced a tangle, timestamps that did not match, bearings that could not be reconciled, and an object that remained a shadow. The immediate consequence was emotional and operational. The forward line still wanted suppression, and the longer the guns stayed silent, the more infantry would move without the cover they expected. Inside the pit, a crew chief slammed a hand against a spade and demanded permission to fire at least one round. Hayes answered by ordering a status call that turned anger into an inventory and forced the pit back into sequence. Each position was named. Each crew chief confirmed the conservative azimuth and the elevation lock. Each loader confirmed rounds staged but not chambered and stated the round type in his possession. Each man repeated the condition under which firing would be authorized, a verified friendly corridor inside the 5-minute window, and 2 independent observations tied to fixed references. Hayes then placed the smoke sheet on top of the board and made it the default if a verified friendly corridor arrived too late for anything else. The immediate effect was a narrowed set of actions that could be executed quickly without abandoning restraint. Higher headquarters pressed again with a directive tied to the next movement cycle, and the net's tone sharpened into impatience. Hayes accepted the directive as a constraint and converted it into immediate behavior. He logged it, acknowledged the deadline, and ordered communications to chase a fresh verification of friendly positions with a clear timestamp, because without that verification, any action would remain limited to smoke. He reduced one more source of volatility by ordering a tarp screen placed between the captive and the gun line, leaving the prisoner visible to guards but no longer a focal point for the crews. By the end of the hour, the shoreline remained a smear of gray, and the dark shape still occupied the sector without admitting what it was. Hayes had not produced certainty, but he had forced the unit to live inside a defensible chain of actions under growing pressure. The cost was time, friction, and a forward line that expected more. The pit had readiness, paperwork, and pressure, and it was running out of clean minutes. Fog kept the Gulf of Salerno flat and without depth, turning the surf line into a moving eraser. In the American gun pit, the air stayed wet enough to glaze steel, and the radios carried clipped voices that treated minutes as expendable. First Lieutenant Andrew Hayes held the pit inside a different economy. He kept the constraint on the board where every crew chief could see it. 2 independent bearings tied to fixed references inside 5 minutes, friendly positions verified by time and relay, uncertain identification treated as a stop condition. Under the awning, the optics technician opened the captured leather case with paperwork beside his hands. He copied the tag number, wrote the time, and lifted out the coastal rangefinder. Its metal smelled of mildew and salt. He wiped the eyepiece, then recorded the film that came off and the moisture that returned when the cloth lifted. The focus wheel caught under his thumb. He logged the roughness, rolled it again, and felt grit under the knurling. He cracked the scale window and saw beads of water clinging where no bead belonged, then recorded that too before he touched a tool. Hayes gave him a check that could be defended without special equipment. The distance to the rock outcrop offshore was on the pit map from the initial sighting, and the ruined wall line inland had been ranged the previous evening when visibility allowed it. The technician aligned the rangefinder on the rock outcrop through a narrow seam in the fog, took a reading, reset the wheel, and repeated. The number drifted beyond acceptable repeat error. He tried the wall line and found a consistent mismatch to the plotted sheet, not noise that could be blamed on a passing gust of fog, but a steady wrongness that returned no matter how carefully he set the wheel. He turned the instrument and found a hairline dent near one bracket, an impact scar that had nudged the housing out of true. He marked the dent's position relative to the scale window, then checked the focus wheel again and felt the same catch return at the same point. Each observation went into the custody record as a condition of the object, not an opinion about the man who had carried it. When he finished, he set the instrument down and waited, hands still, until Hayes saw the notes and nodded. Behind the tarp screen, the captured observer watched the rangefinder handled like evidence. His bound hands flexed once when the dent was recorded, then he forced them still. The corporal saw the movement and kept questioning inside Hayes's restrictions. He asked discreet checks tied to logged facts. Whether the instrument had been struck hard enough to bend its body, whether sea spray had reached the scale window, and whether any field repair had been made after the strike. The prisoner answered yes, yes, and no. The corporal also recorded the prisoner's statement that the instrument had belonged to an observation partner who had died earlier in the fighting, and that he had carried it forward without workshop calibration. The note could not authorize fire, but it explained the man's rigid attention when the housing was measured and the case tag tightened around it. The net pressed for fire as the forward line tightened its own schedule. A relay demanded immediate suppression of the dark shape near the surf, tied to an infantry push that would begin within the next movement cycle. Higher headquarters warned about enemy coastal guns and demanded speed. Hayes forced the pressure into traceable form. He required the latest friendly position with a timestamp repeated back verbatim. He then demanded confirmation from a second relay so drift could be detected rather than smuggled into the pit as certainty. The reports came back close enough to collide. The friendly corridor and the suspected sector now overlapped by a margin that exceeded the pit's tolerance. Hayes did not negotiate with overlap. He changed the pit state in steps that could not be mistaken. Breaches opened and stayed open. Ammunition was staged but not chambered. The plotting assistant placed the smoke sheet on top of the board and wrote the limits in plain language. Smoke only upon verified clearance of the friendly corridor inside the 5-minute window. Rounds capped, azimuth bounded by hard stops. Hayes wrote a temporary ceasefire entry in the log, citing target identification failure under limited visibility and friendly overlap. He set the ceasefire window for 10 minutes and wrote the start time on the same line so the pit would share one clock. He signed his name and required the senior non-commissioned officer to countersign as witness. He then answered the radio net with the same discipline that held the breaches open. He relayed that firing remained suspended due to friendly overlap under limited visibility and that smoke could be provided when clearance was verified inside the 5-minute window. He gave the timestamp of the decision and had it repeated back. Irritation on the net did not vanish, but it narrowed into compliance when the time and restriction became part of the record. Inside the 10-minute ceasefire window, Hayes harvested only inputs that could change the decision. He ordered observers to anchor on the rock outcrop and wall line and report bearings with timestamps at 1-minute intervals. He ordered communications to obtain a single current statement of friendly movement for the next 10 minutes, so drift could not hide inside vague phrasing. The plotting assistant computed the overlap as a band, not a point, and wrote the band beside the hazard arc so every man could see how little space remained for error. The pit did not accept silence easily. A loader stared toward the gray as if staring could carve a target out of it. A crew chief kept his hands near the lanyard and then forced them away because the breech open order made any pull an unmistakable act. Another man argued that infantry would move without cover and that a single round could change the balance. Hayes answered agitation with procedure. He ran a status call where each crew chief confirmed the current lay, the hard stops, and the round type staged, then repeated the condition under which any firing would be authorized. The call absorbed anger into repetition and left no space for a private shortcut. At the equipment table, the technician produced a signed note and handed it forward through the custody chain. The captured rangefinder could not produce reliable range under present conditions due to impact deformation, moisture intrusion, and inconsistent repeat readings against fixed references. Hayes placed the note under the ceasefire entry so the record showed cause chained to evidence. He added the prisoner's logged admissions about impact and spray as supporting constraints. The object, the process, and the names now formed a single file that explained why the guns were quiet. At the 9th minute, the fog seam widened enough to reveal a thin, vertical line inside the gray, steady while surf flashes came and went. The berm observer reported the bearing with a time stamp. The pit observer confirmed the same bearing within the same minute. The line sat near the edge of the friendly corridor inside the overlap band. It was a fact, not a permission. The corporal asked one more discreet check tied to a logged feature, whether a fixed wreck marker existed near that stretch of beach used as an improvised reference. The prisoner answered yes, and the answer landed as a restraint rather than an opening. If the glass cannot tell the truth, the gun does not speak. The corporal wrote the sentence exactly as delivered with the time and his name, and carried it to Hayes without stepping into the plotting space. Hayes treated it as a constraint statement tied to a tagged instrument and assigned inspection, not as a bargain for mercy. He turned the notebook so the crew chiefs could read it from their side of the board. Then he acted in a way that kept the chain unbroken. He extended the ceasefire in writing for 5 minutes, citing the newly observed vertical line near the friendly corridor, the overlap band, and the documented instrument error. He ordered the observers to hold on the vertical line and the fixed references, and he ordered communications to obtain a single clearance statement with a timestamp that could survive later scrutiny. The decision altered the pit immediately. A crew chief released the unused lanyard and put both hands on the smoke sheet, rehearsing bounded settings that could be executed the moment clearance arrived. Under the sergeant's supervision, rounds were shifted from forward racks to rear staging, turning impulse into inventory and leaving no single man with a chambered round to tempt him into action. Communications demanded a clean clearance time, and received partial updates that required repeat back before they counted. When the original 10-minute window ended, the guns remained silent, held in place by open breaches, signed notes, and a record that refused to be rewritten by impatience. Fog thinned in patches rather than clearing, but the patches were enough to change what could be defended. A seam opened over the waterline and held for long seconds, exposing hard edges where the gray had only suggested mass. The vertical line near the surf resolved into a mast stump and a leaning spar, both fixed against the tide. The dark shape did not advance or retreat. It sat where sandbars and weather had pinned it, wreckage that could imitate a weapon position in fog but could not act like one. First Lieutenant Andrew Hayes did not treat the reveal as relief. He treated it as an input with a time stamp and a custody of attention. He ordered the berm observer to stay on the mast stump and call any change in outline. He ordered the pit observer to stay locked on the rock outcrop and the ruined wall line so bearings did not drift while eyes chased the new shape. He required both observers to report inside the same minute and to state how long the mast stump remained visible. The plotting assistant marked the obstruction on the map cover, drew a narrow bearing band around its position, and wrote both observer names beside the minute of observation so the pit shared one defensible fact. Communications returned with a clearer picture of friendly movement. The forward patrol limit had advanced, but the report carried explicit timing and a defined corridor. A relay stated the last verified position, the direction of next movement, and a narrow window in which no friendly elements would cross the surf-adjacent strip. Hayes made the operator repeat the statement back, then wrote it into the log with the relay identifier and verification time. Corridor clearance did not authorize engagement of the obstruction or anything beyond it. It only permitted a screening action under bounded settings that kept rounds out of the friendly corridor. Hayes shifted the unit from extended ceasefire to controlled smoke under the already signed sheet. He wrote the change as a separate entry with a reason chain to evidence. Visibility still limited, fixed obstruction identified near the surf line, friendly corridor clearance received within the 5-minute window, objective to screen movement rather than strike. He signed, and the senior sergeant countersigned as witness. The earlier ceasefire entry and the optics inspection note remained on the same page, so the decision could be read as a continuous chain rather than a new mood. The gun crews responded to permission that arrived with limits. Breaches stayed open until each crew chief confirmed azimuth and elevation against the smoke sheet. The plotting assistant called the bounded settings, and each crew repeated them back before the sergeant allowed a round forward. Loaders handled smoke shells with deliberate pace, keeping packaging and fuses from becoming another variable. Hayes watched hands and listened to repeat backs, because compliance could be measured in posture and cadence, not in claims. At the moment the sheet allowed, the sergeant ordered breaches closed. A single smoke round went into each chamber, but no lanyard moved until communications confirmed the corridor remained clear at that minute. The operator read the time aloud. Hayes wrote it as the firing time, so the record matched the act. The sergeant issued the execute order as a procedural command, and the crews pulled lanyards without improvisation. The guns spoke once each, low and contained, and the crews immediately reopened breaches, returning the pit to a safer state while smoke took effect. The rounds landed short of the wreck and began to build a spreading screen that mixed with the fog. The screen did not reveal a target. It denied sight and cut the observation line that had been forcing the infantry to choose between movement and exposure. Hayes ordered no adjustment beyond the sheet limits and capped the sequence at the planned number. The forward net acknowledged the screen and reported movement continuing with reduced exposure. Hayes logged the acknowledgement with time and call sign, then restored ceasefire by entry and by action, leaving breaches open and guns quiet. The captured rangefinder was sealed in its leather case with a fresh tag and a new custody entry. It had changed status from potential aid to documented hazard. The optics technician wrote a short summary in plain language that matched his earlier notes. Impact deformation observed near a bracket, moisture present in the scale window, repeat readings inconsistent against fixed references, instrument not reliable for live fire under current conditions. Hayes attached the summary to the fire control log as supporting material and noted that the instrument would not be used to inform fire decisions without proper calibration. The prisoner was brought forward from behind the tarp only when the guns were safe and the plotting board was covered. Hayes allowed the corporal to conclude the limited questioning with discrete checks tied to the record rather than the battle's emotion, the approximate location of the observation point from which the instrument had been used, common landmarks in that sector, and whether any coastal gun had maintained a clear line of sight to the beachhead through the morning fog. The prisoner answered in short statements that could be written and timed, then fell silent when the corporal moved on, his role reduced to a source of constrained context rather than a lever on the guns. A guard detail arrived with instructions to move the prisoner rearward for processing. Hayes required the receiving sergeant to sign the transfer, including the prisoner's name, condition, and the time of departure. The bound hands were checked for circulation. A canteen was offered under guard control, and the prisoner drank without looking toward the guns. The rangefinder case was carried separately as tagged property, and the custody chain followed it with signatures rather than with anyone's judgment about the man who had carried it. With immediate pressure reduced, Hayes drafted a short after-action note that focused on procedure and immediate effect. Under limited visibility and friendly overlap, firing had been suspended pending verification and documentation of the hazard arc. An enemy observer had been interviewed under restrictions and kept outside the fire control chain. A captured optical instrument had been inspected and found unreliable under present conditions. Smoke had been employed only after friendly corridor clearance and identification of a fixed obstruction near the surf line with start time, stop time, and round count recorded and matched to the ammunition tally. The pit returned to routine in the same wet air. Observers resumed scheduled scans and time-stamp bearings to fixed references. Communications maintained time-stamp friendly position updates even when the net quieted. Crew chiefs rotated men through wiping and covering equipment, keeping grit out of mechanisms that had already shown what salt and moisture could do. Late in the shift, the fog thickened again, and the wreck's mast stump vanished back into gray. Hayes ordered the observers to treat any future reappearance as a known deception and to call it as an obstruction with a bearing band, not as an emergent threat. Before he was relieved, Hayes closed the log with the same discipline that had held the breaches open. He reviewed entries for missing times and missing initials. He checked that the ceasefire window and its extension were chained to their causes, that the smoke authorization had a start time and a stop time, and that the round count matched the tally. He confirmed that the custody tags for the rangefinder and the prisoner transfer form were signed by both sides. Only then did he sign the final line and hand the book to the relieving officer with the page turned open to the chain of decisions. The generator sputtered, recovered, and kept the radios alive. Outside the berm, the beachhead remained a place of partial sight and heavy air. Inside the pit, the state of the guns was no longer a matter of temper. It was open breeches, bounded sheets, and names written beside times, a routine that kept the muzzle aligned with what could be proven.